Hey everybody, Engaged Magic, celebration of cultural identity as Afro-Caribbean and Latino practitioners, social justice magic and activism. These are four topics that could easily become the basis for a year-long course. But on today's show, we're going to be talking to two of the leaders within the comunidad espiritual Latina, who happen to be two of my favorite practitioners, friends, and fam. And so we'll dig into this great topic and more when we get back. And welcome back, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. John Michael Salvato. It's my privilege to be your host for our show today. And with us is Leilani Flores Celestial and Dominic Guerriero, both of whom I'm going to allow to tell you a little bit about themselves. But Leilani and Dominic, thank you so much for just honoring us with the opportunity to talk about so many incredible topics. And welcome to season 4 of the Brew.
Yay!
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's do this. For those who are watching, if you're watching for the first time, this is a live and interactive program. The main reason I say that on every show is to remind me to turn the comments on. And if you're watching and you would like to ask questions, make comments, share some of your perspective, we encourage you to do so. Just make sure that on the wherever you're watching this from, make sure if it's on the Facebook group, you click on the little button that says something like facebook.com StreamYard or StreamYard.com Facebook. There's a link at the top of the comments, and that will give you permission. So right off the bat, I see there are some people who are actually following that. We've got Rob Abbott saying big blessings, y'all. Back to you too, Rob. And so let's get started for the folks who haven't seen either one of you or both of you on previous interviews that we've done on one another's shows. Leilani, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, and what led you to your spiritual practice.
All right. Well, my name is Leilani, and I am a bruja. In English, that's like a mage, someone who practices magic. I'm an espiritista. In English, that's a spiritist, a spiritualist, a medium. I'm a curandera. In English, that would be a healer. Educator, podcaster, and of course, a small business owner of the Magical Solution. I was born with gifts that started manifesting around 6. And I was lucky enough to have been born in a family that fostered, those kinds of abilities. And at a very young age, around 11, 12, I was already giving readings to outside people. And by the time I was 17, 19, I was able to give services. So that's what led me here.
That's an amazing story. And I always love and really appreciate hearing from folks who actually had that kind of family that supported us and fostered those gifts. We're just so fortunate when we're born into such a family. So it's great to hear that as well. And where are you living now?
New York.
In
I'm
the city.
relocating from one part of New York to the other, which is, a whole story in and of itself. But yes, New York all the way.
Okay, well, we're so glad to have you here. Dominic, for those who haven't heard from you before or might not be familiar, tell us a little bit about your background, what led you to your spiritual practice, and where you are today.
Well, I'm also in New York City too, in Queens. And my ethnic background is Filipino, Italian, and German. And the Filipino experience is very similar to Latin America because we were also colonized by Spain and, have that kind of earlier tradition with the Catholicism over it. And my aunt taught me how to read tarot cards when I was 16 years old. And I always had some kind of connection to the Afro-Caribbean religions because my mom would always go to these spiritual shops called botanicas. And from there it kind of like drew my interest, and I was initiated into Afro-Brazilian candomblé in 2005, and I became a fully fledged priest in 2019. So it takes years, and I'm still learning, and it's an ongoing journey and process.
Well, we're glad to have you, and glad to have your experience and your expertise, and you're also a teacher as well, as both of you are. But so you bring a little bit of an historic context to some of the stuff, and I really appreciate that as well. In our world today, one of the things we like to do with this broadcast is, rather than just doing interviews, which can be very informative and give us a glimpse into the people that are leaders in our community, we like to go a step further and make this sort of a round table discussion. That's why we chose the name The Brew, similar to The View. Only we like to think of all of us on here as divas, not just Meghan McCain. And so our idea today is to talk about some intersectionality. And I think there's great healing in reaffirming our cultural heritage, reconnecting with our ancestors at both the human level and the supernatural level, the metaphysical level. But history tells us that in so many cases, our ancestors, much like our contemporaries, in many parts of the country, many parts of the world, were oppressed. They suffered discrimination and injustices, often, to the point of bloodshed, to losing their lives. So I think it would be a great place to kick this off today by starting about or focusing on what we think our magical practice can bring to the world in terms of creating a shift that either restores justice or allows healing to begin, or both. And what does that look like to either one of you? And just jump in. And if if you have questions too, ask questions of us. This is a roundtable discussion.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the practices of our ancestors, the people of the global majority, right? Their practices were rooted very much in balance of nature, right? And that could have looked like a lot of things. We were stewards of nature. We took care of the land. We took care of the community. All of these things, I think, shaped how our magic looked as well, and how our spirituality looked. And so when you start to look at it from when you start to bring it down to the microcosm, you start looking at those interpersonal relationships with each other, with the community, and you start seeing things like injustice, seeing things like abuse, seeing things like discrimination. Now you're looking at, okay, how do I restore balance to that in the same way that my ancestors did with their environment around them? And so I think our practices are very much rooted in balance with nature equals justice in society. And so there's a lot of this, you'll see a lot of justice magic within our practices.
That's really interesting that you say that, because if I'm hearing you correctly, you're pointing out the fact that really what we do, and just to be clear to anyone out here, I'm not suddenly changing heritage, but the Italian tradition and the Latina uh, traditions are so closely interwoven, mainly because both draw on those African roots, that I can say we. And that what I think I hear you saying, Leilani, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the work that our ancestors did was may look different from the work that we're doing specifically now, but it's the spirit of that work is the same. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have television, they didn't have some of the things that we have today, where we have a different means of getting that message out, doing that energetic shift, working that magic, and working with the ancestors, the orishas, the old ones, as spiritual allies to help make it happen. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying
I
something
think at
different?
the core, what I'm saying is that at the core of our ancestral magic and our ancestral practices, at the core of it, it's about balance. What that looks like and how that manifests with the tools that you use, with the techniques, the prayers, the rituals, that will look different from culture to culture and from place to place. But the idea, the as above, so below, is balance and restoring balance. So yeah, back in the old days, if your son gets taken because he was wrongly accused of a crime and now he's put in jail, the magic for that mother would look very different from what it would look like today. She would do other kinds of things to get him out of jail because she knows this is unjustified. Versus now we can get on Twitter and make a scene, and millions of people, and using the energy of millions of people understanding that this is an unjustified situation can help restore balance. So ultimately, this idea of justice, this idea of balance, and this idea of a community as a whole, connected to their ancestral roots, is really is about self-healing, but it's also about the responsibility of the community. And that's ancient and now. You know what I mean? Back in the day, the community raised the child. Now that's not so much, but we're starting to see it reintroduced because of the internet. The internet is raising the children now.
Yeah.
And the children are raising the children. And I think that's why it's so important that education be what it is. That's why people like you, people like Dominic, it's so important for us to give out the right information to the youth, because they're adorable. They get a piece of information, they immediately go teach it to someone else, and there are some fallbacks to that, but there are also some really great things about that. It means that we can get a message out a lot faster.
Right. Dominic, jump in on that, because
Yeah.
there's another topic that Leilani just started to go into that I want us to talk about, but I want your perspective on this as well.
Well, two things come to mind, both something historical and something from our era. Like in the historical sense, because our traditions survived under oppressive regimes from both the church and either the Spanish, French, or Portuguese, whoever was or British or Dutch colonial power that was in place. A lot of the times the rituals and the magic and the religion was used as a form of rebellion, as in the case in Haiti, in the Haitian Revolution. Also, what brings to mind what Leilani was talking about, there's a famous documented case of Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, and she was always involved in social justice and helping people out that were wrongfully imprisoned. So there's one story where there were these two men that were supposed to be executed publicly. They were, supposed to be hanged in New Orleans. And what she did was she went to, and this is that combination of the Catholicism with the African practices. She went to St. Louis Cathedral and put like hot peppers in her mouth and, stood before the altar and, until she felt that pain, and then did this ritual. And then what happened was the day that the hanging took place, there was a thunderstorm and the rope broke. And they did eventually, hang the two gentlemen. But the law, when it was introduced into the legislature, they abolished public hangings in the state of Louisiana. So there was, because of what she did. The second thing is like a lot of the protests that are happening today and the activism. Two things come to mind with indigenous people. With the water protectors, Standing Rock is an example, and then the Black Lives Matter movement. We see a lot of practitioners, Black and indigenous practitioners, bringing sage, bringing the resins, bringing different forms of cleansing to protect themselves, from violence. and counter protesters and the authorities and the police and all that. So we have seen that also. So there is like the behind the scenes type of magic, and then there is the on the front lines type of magic. And I think both of them are vital. One isn't more than the other, because the people that are out in the front lines need that strength and energy. But those that are in the background, lighting the candles at home, or doing those, or pouring those libations to the ancestors, also adds to the collective.
I agree. I've always said that, like I think we as a community really need to uplift each other during these times and not be so judgmental about how we protest and what that looks like, because not everyone can be that person, get tear gassed and fighting with police. Like Dominic said, you have the people who pray, you have the people who do the charity and get the donations together, get the supplies together for the protesters. You have the medics and the nurses coming out to make sure that our protesters are safe. You have the soccer moms on the back with their cell phone getting ready to call all these representatives and people behind the scenes. You have those individuals on social media who create fundraisers so that they can get money to bail out these protesters. So like everyone has a role to play. Even the 13-year-old kid who's having those really hard discussions with their parents about these subjects, and they're doing it for that purpose. It's like, look, I'm 13 and you may think I don't know anything, but this is my protest. This is my way of doing it, and it's just as valid. It's just as valid.
Absolutely, and it's all as magical. I mean, I think that's one of the things that when you look at pop culture witchcraft compared to the older traditions, it's one of those distinctions is that we don't just say, okay, so our magic is now we laid out the pretty cloth, we set up the candles, we're going to do the ritual, and that's magic. It is. But it's also magic when we're cooking the food to feed the people in the front lines, when we're sitting there just holding space for them while they're engaged.
Breaking generational curses with these conversations.
And so we have another question here, and I'm going to remind everybody again, please, because we like to recognize who's asking the question. This person might not have heard me in the beginning when I said you need to click the link that's on the post so that we can see your face. We give Facebook permission to let us know who you are. But the question is a great question. It says, what steps in your individual practices do you take to make sure your outlook on the situation is just and is in the best interest for all involved before deciding to go forward and make an energetic shift? Fantastic question. Either one of you want to jump in first?
So I think that there's a two-parter to that. I really do. I feel like there is the part that involves your individual moral compass, which is very much informed by your spiritual practice. It's very much informed with your connection to spirit and to your guides. And I think, at its core, in essence, you know what's right and what's wrong. There's a visceral response to injustice. When you see someone kicking a puppy or harming a baby, or that's a visceral response of that's not right. And then you have the other part of magical social justice that has very much to do with the community. Again, as above, so below. This idea of law, policy, governments were created as a representation of divine law and governance. So if the laws are fucked up, if the government is fucked up, if all that is fucked up, we have a problem. And it becomes the responsibility of the community to rectify that so that we can have those things in place that help to guide us to justice,
Absolutely. And we can't discount the sovereignty of the practitioner because, as you said, it's our moral compass that guides our work. So I don't know if it's right for somebody else to engage magic in response to what we saw horrifically happen to George Floyd, or to bring attention to the fact that right now, in this moment, there are two people of color who are missing, where news stations in Phoenix, for example, with one young man who's missing there, and in other stations around the country are not carrying that news story because it's not a pretty little blonde Barbie white girl.
And I think
And
part of the
Yeah.
community is to hold each other responsible. That is part of figuring out what's just and what's not just. So like, for example, we have the George Floyd situation. It is very just to do some stuff about that, right? With your magic, for sure. But then you have the Gabby situation, and you have like astrologers out here, looking at her chart to justify the abuse and the missingness and the possible deathness, to prophesy her death based on her astrology chart. That is irresponsible.
Yeah.
But you know what? The community is
It's
calling them
disgusting.
out on it, and that's the point: is that we hold each other accountable.
and, and Rob just said, "Shit gets real when the sister says the F word." Word.
The filthy sailor comes out.
Dominic, you want to tackle that?
I'm gonna add to it with some of the nuances. So I think too, and this is in my unique position as someone that is not of Afro-Latina heritage, even though like our culture has a lot in common with Latin America. It's still like very much outsider-ish. So I think when a lot of people come to the Afro-Caribbean religions, whatever denomination, it's important not to center yourself, but to listen to what the elders and people in the community are saying, and not to impose your own viewpoint or your privilege upon that. And I have a colleague who is a voodoo priestess. Her name is Lady Speech Sankofa, and she's an activist. And she brought up an example of, there was a German artist who went to Nigeria, and Oshun herself called her, outside of the culture and everything, but she didn't center herself. Rather, she asked the priestesses of Oshun, she's like, what do you need? What can I do? I have money. I have privilege. The German government has my ear. I have influence. What do you need? And they told her, well, the Oshun Grove in Nigeria is under threat from development, and having it as a cultural site, like, being destroyed. So what she did was, she used her power and her privilege to declare it a UNESCO historical site, and then she made, sculptures, and they initiated her as a priestess of Oshun. But she didn't she didn't make it all about herself. She asked, what do you need? What can I contribute?
Yes.
Rather than, and sometimes you just see like this culture of vulture kind of syndrome, where people will take, from Black and Indigenous spiritual communities, but then not contribute anything back. And meanwhile, people are being oppressed, people are suffering, and you're reaping the spiritual benefit of it, but you're not giving anything back to the community, and that is a shame.
I think that's a great place for us to take our first public service announcement break, because I want to talk about that on the other side, about why it's problematic for cultural appropriation to take place, not just because of the disregard for the integrity of the heritage of the people from whom that tradition came, but for other reasons as well. So we'll talk more about that. But we're gonna kind of dive off of the point that Dominic just mentioned about not making this about ourselves, and asking how we can literally dethrone ourselves and put another in our place, as a means of service, as a means of compassion, and as a means of magically beginning to heal this divide. So with that, we'll have our first public service announcement from the Charter for Compassion, and I'll see both of you in a couple minutes.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures.
To dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there.
To honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being.
Treating everybody without exception.
With absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life.
To refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain.
To act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest.
To impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody.
And to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies.
Is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately.
And that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion
to the center of morality and religion.
To return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of scripture
that breeds violence,
hatred, or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
about other traditions, religions, and cultures.
To encourage a positive appreciation of cultural
and religious diversity.
To cultivate
an informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world.
Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.
And we're back thanks to the folks at the Charter for Compassion. And for those of you watching, please consider going to charterforcompassion.org and sign the charter. We would really appreciate that, and I know they would as well. So let's dive in where we left off, guys, because I think that the topic of cultural appropriation and how we balance that by actually making ourselves of service to the community, with whom we might have a true affinity. We may feel a deep connection, as do I, with spiritual entities like Oromia, like Yamaya, Oshun, in my case, and those connections may be very deep. But let's talk a little bit about the ways in which we approach that by making ourselves of service.
I think that's a tough question to answer because I don't think there'll ever be a satisfactory answer for everyone. You know what I mean? Because I've actually heard counter arguments to people saying, well, I'm a white privileged person with a platform, so I'm going to move aside and allow people of color to come on and talk about themselves. And I've heard the counter argument of, well, I don't want to be allowed. I don't want you to step aside and allow me. I want my own platform. And they have every right to feel that, and I think it's one of those things where the answer will never, it just won't be when there's so much pain. I think the best thing that we can do is just allow people to be and just mind your damn business. Just mind your business. Right. Just mind your business. You know what I mean? Like I think cultures, and I don't want to sound insensitive and I don't want to sound rough. I know I can sound that way sometimes, but I think people should appreciate their stuff, their own stuff, and love the similarities across culture and honor and devote yourself to spirits outside of your culture and give yourself of that. But I think ultimately, when it comes to speaking on it, when it comes to teaching it, when it comes to having an opinion about it, you know what I mean? Just let the people who know the thing do the thing.
I'm so glad you said that, because my frustration, as a teacher, as somebody, despite being mixed race, the simple fact is that I could pass for 100% white, even though my dad is darker
And I'm
than
a
most
white
of.
passing Latina, and I get the shit for it too.
And I think that it's so important that for those of us in that situation, to recognize that no matter how great our privilege is, there's nothing we can do to make it better for the people on whose backs these traditions were built. We can't undo 400 years of oppression and suffering and murder and injustice, and that's why it is important. The most sensible thing that I could think about is just to shut up and let the teachers teach.
And I think also, too, to kind of piggyback off what Dominic said earlier, ask them what is valuable to them that you can offer. If it's money, then buy the products. If it's recognition, then give them the platform. If it's, whatever it is that they hold to be valuable, that they feel will elevate them and make them and give them just an inkling of something, then give that. That's what you give, and that's what you offer. That's how you step aside. You know what I mean? But to sort of do it in this way of like, oh, I'm allowing this to happen, or I'm extending my hand to do this. Like, they don't want favors. We don't want favors. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things where we come in this as a community, and we're not, and I don't think anyone's mad. We're not mad at like, at what's the right word? At practitioners who want to help and are not quite getting it right. It's just a matter of being patient. It's a matter of just listening,
Yeah, and knowing that it's okay to not get it right.
Right.
And that the best way to not get it wrong is, like you just said, to ask.
Just ask.
Just say, hey, what can I do? Rob says, speaking of cultural appropriation, by the way, Rob, I absolutely love you. These are fantastic comments. Speaking of cultural appropriation, an old school conjure versus this new fad of Lee press-on or overnight hoodoo, people were not considered a conjure worker until they went and paid respect, mostly at a cemetery, on their knees, crying to give true reverence to the ancestors. And so I think Rob is asking us to comment on that, and I'm going to jump in with that. I think Dominic is having some problems with his camera, so we'll have him back in a few minutes. But one of the things that we talked about and talk about often in the mystery school is how even when you're approaching the old ones in your tradition, whatever that tradition happens to be, but if you're going to the Orishas, if you're going to gods and goddesses or the spirits of the plants and your plant ancestors, we always recommend that the first thing that you say when cultivating that relationship isn't necessarily just a worshipful thing, or, oh, can you answer my prayer? This is what I need you for, Maria Padilla. If I don't get this guy, I'm gonna, I'm gonna, be so depressed all weekend. No, the most important thing you could do is to approach that other being with a heart that's open and full, and say, I want to cultivate a relationship with you. What can I do? What can I be there for you? In the Italian tradition, we say that the reason we work with our ancestors first and foremost over any other entity is because we have the ability in this world to do some of the things they need in that world that are of service to them. They may need us to get the herbs, the tobacco, the plant materia, or the alcohol, and do a specific ritual that they're not able to do on their side. And so I think when you make it about service first, then it really exposes, as Rob said, it lays bare that that agenda of the new, Lee press-on hoodoo, where they haven't paid their debt to the ancestors and to the Orishas and to the ancient ones but they're all out there looking to market and make that green.
You know, it's interesting. I love that you said making it of service. There's a religious philosopher by the name of Jason Miller, who wrote an entire book, if you will, about this idea of service. And you know, he talks about how there's such a misunderstanding of that word, because people think of the word service, they think of servitude, they think of bowing down, they think of being lesser than. And when he describes it in terms of its religious, of its spiritual meaning, it's not that. It's giving of yourself in totality with the other person. Like it's allowing your extra to be their support, you know, and vice versa. Like it becomes a healing thing for you as well. And I think it was just such a beautiful, I wish I can remember the exact line, but if I find it, I'll make sure to comment it on this
Yeah.
live. It's a beautiful line. Beautiful.
Absolutely. Dominic, I don't know how much you were able to, are you frozen? Are you sitting very still? You are.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. Yeah, the Wi-Fi just went out in the neighborhood.
So were you able to hear any of that discussion on cultural appropriation? Because I know before the show, the three of us were talking about one really simple example that some folks might not even think about, and that is how quickly we adopt in an attempt, as Leilani said, to really do the right thing. We sometimes don't think things through and ask, and I know I'm absolutely guilty of this because I got tired of having fights with other practitioners who said, no, the word to use that's been generally accepted is Latinx, which is problematic even from a linguistic standpoint. But talk a little bit about that, about how cultural appropriation and allowing the colonialists, we see in magical practices, we see it in pop culture witchcraft, how a dirty old man in 1949 who just wanted to see women naked and ostensibly abused that power, created a whole tradition around his agenda. And then there were women who said, oh, see, it's all about the goddess and it's all about women. And it was the patriarchy pulling their bullshit all over again and disguising it in women's clothing.
Well, before I get into the decolonization aspect, some people prefer Latinx, some people prefer Latine, which is more grammatically correct. Now, the Romance languages do have gender, Spanish, but like before colonization, the indigenous people of what is now Latin America had different words for different binaries and different genders and such. So that was already in place. But when the Europeans came, they imposed the language, upon us, because the same happened, in the Philippines too, where they imposed the religion and even the language, and that changes the way people think, the way that they view things. Some have said that the term Latinx was coined by a white professor. So some people have said that, like, why are we allowing people outside of the culture to make definitions for us when there are already like existing indigenous words, for different genders and different identities. So again, like, it's some people will use it, some people absolutely hate it. I think it's a matter of preference at this point with some people. I'm not gonna like argue with some 80-year-old Cuban grandmother, like, don't use that, this or that, because no, we're not going there, Right. So there is that, and in terms of colonization and how it has impacted, spirituality, I could look at, within our religious traditions, certain aesthetics and hierarchy you could see coming from Catholicism and very European ideas of like this extravagance, right, with the altars and the fabrics and if you look at the earlier ceremonies, that wasn't there. You know, this idea of having these really fancy implements and fabrics, and they look beautiful, mind you. You know, I think it's a great thing, but you know, when you look at it from a different lens, like, where did this come from? You know, where did this aesthetic come from? Where did this even conversations about patriarchy, about machismo, and someone being machista too, to, you know, like, and the, you know, the role of women in Ifa, like, there's a whole, like, conversations to be had about that.
Yeah, you know, we were talking the other night about even in pop culture. If we look at the 50s, for example, and the early 60s, it's easy to overlook like the decisions, the courageous decisions that people like Desi Arnaz and Celia Cruz would make in their performance art to take that risk and actually make a bold, subversive, you know, fu to the patriarchy move by the Lucy show, or I Love Lucy, having you know, a performance that's dedicated to the Orisha, to have you know, Celia Cruz go into these places where she had to fight to be able to even get booked, and you know, and just to slide right in there under the azucar, to slide in the rest of that rich heritage and spirituality, you know, to where we fast forward today, and a dear friend of ours was on the show a couple seasons ago, who had become, who's just a beautiful practitioner, a loving practitioner, but lost sight, I think, in that moment, and kind of stunned the other guests by saying that synchronization doesn't really exist, and that you know, so for example, that a particular figure of Stella Maris, or Our Lady of the Regalia, is doesn't represent an Orisha. They're separate people, and that synchronization is a white myth. And I could understand that other people were getting agita from watching that, but I could understand how, in a culture that had been so whitewashed, that was once part of, you know, it is still technically part of the African continent, but has been so whitewashed, so colonialized, that people who are oppressed have a tendency to repeat the lies that their oppressors taught them, and that in and of itself is a place where we can be of service and of witness and patient, and say, you know, okay, so from your perspective, you're dealing with two separate you know, people, that you're you know, dealing with the saint, and you're dealing with the Orisha as separate. That's perfectly valid. If that's how you do your religion, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong,
Right.
but I'm also not going to let you tell somebody else that they're wrong as well.
I think it's also too, you know, to understand like the historical aspect of it. That was a power move with regards to survival of the practice. So
Dominic,
like,
we're getting feedback from your side. Here, I temporarily muted Dominic. Go ahead.
So, you know, you had to, in order for your spirits to survive and to make it across the transatlantic trade, you had to do that. Is it still going?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's doing it again.
But now we're kind of re-entering that movement of reconnecting with our you know, ancestral practices, and so we're starting to see, you know, people going back and saying, okay, let's sort of skip this middleman and let's go back to the original source, and that's totally fine too. You know, as far as spiritual energies are concerned, yes, they are they're very different spirits. They're not the same spirit. But when it comes to that history of survival. That's one piece of it. And also, too, let's not forget there are a lot of converts from Christianity and from Catholicism that are going back to their roots. And maybe all they do know are those saints. And so it is a nice segue. It is a nice, bridge to get them to reconnect to their culture. So I think it still serves a purpose. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I totally get what he's saying. It's the same concept when we talk about Santísima Muerte, or when we talk about some of these other spirits, where you just kind of, dump all of the death spirits into one category, and it's like, oh, that's all Santísima. No, they're all individual. They're all death spirits in and of themselves. They represent a universal force of death that is unmistakable across cultures, for sure. But we can't deny that they have their own separate personalities and energies,
Absolutely. And I guess we're losing Dominic again. So I am so sorry, because I really wanted to have him weigh in on this. We have one last question. Hopefully Dominic will be able to get back in before this is it. I think he's jumping out and coming back. But my final question to you, because we could talk for another 4 hours.
Sure.
Without question, there are so many other questions that I can think of, but the one I'll end with tonight is, what would your message be to the person who, regardless of their ethnic heritage, feels drawn to the Afro-Caribbean traditions? What would you say to that person about how to proceed, and how to proceed with respect, and how to proceed in a way that's authentically going to edify them spiritually?
So I feel like this is going to ruffle a few feathers.
Yay!
Because it was a reality that I also had to face, being a very light-skinned Latina. And the reality was, I didn't grow up in the Taino, quote unquote Taino culture, the culture of Borinquen. I did not grow up with that. I did not grow up speaking the language. I did not grow up in that space. So when I wanted, as a Latina person, as a Taino, reconnect with that, I had to swallow my pride and still admit that, despite the fact that Taino indigenous blood runs through my veins, I was still a guest. I was still a guest. Now imagine if you're a white person, or someone who's not a part of that at all. You're a guest. And I know that that term guest is almost like just as bad as, like, you're an outsider, you're this, you're an outcast. That term really ruffles a lot of people. But I think what needs to be understood is that just because you're a guest doesn't mean you don't have value. You know what I mean? Your stewardship, your honor, your devotion, your respect, your reverence, your study is all important. It's important in all of it, and it allows you to communicate better and to have dialogue with people in those communities. And that's what helps you grow spiritually. That's what helps elevate your spirit. But when you come in, and this is something that I'm very, like, hard about, if you come in, you get a little bit of nuggets of wisdom, and then you go out and you teach that, or you go out and you profit off of that, and you go out and that's where the problem lies. So my message is, no matter what, if you didn't grow up with it, you're a guest. Even if it's in your blood, you're a guest. And it's okay to be a guest. Eventually you will be a member. You know what I mean? But that comes with study, that comes with time, that comes with reverence, that comes with so much work. And you have to be willing to put in that work. And I think spirituality as a whole is work. It's work. The magic, the relationships with your spirits, the altars, that shit is expensive. It's work. There's so much in it, and you have to be willing to do that. And if you want to half-ass it, if you only want to do a little bit of it, if you only want to be a part-time spiritualist, then maybe it isn't for you. You know what I mean? And I think people just need to have an honest conversation with themselves. People need to have an honest conversation with why they want to be a part of a particular community. Are you doing it for power or for empowerment? Are you doing it for, you know what I mean? Like, you have to ask yourself these questions and figure out what it is that what's going to keep you on that straight and narrow the whole time. You know, and that's going to change, and that purpose and those reasons for joining something or being a part of something is going to change over time as you learn and grow, and that is perfectly fine. You know, I think the most important message I could give is be willing to transform. Be willing to shed your skin over and over and over again. And sometimes shedding that skin is excruciatingly painful. And sometimes it's a beautiful experience. But be open and willing to do all of it with your mouth shut and your heart open.
Very powerful, Ashe. You know, I can't help but think, and I've heard so many times people say that, you know, well, that's gatekeeping, and that's this, and that's that, and you know, oh, I don't have any time for closed traditions. And I want everyone who's listening, if you've ever felt that way, and I don't want to invalidate your feelings, but I want you to consider for a minute what was just so beautifully expressed by Leilani. And that is, and I want you to think that in every community, everywhere on the planet, especially in spiritual communities, that has taken place since time immemorial. If you go to any of the mystery school traditions, including Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, you know, even some of the Protestant traditions, there was a tradition of bringing the new person in as a guest in their house, feeding them a little bit, and then saying, and now you can go home and think about these things that you've just learned. Not go out and teach them, not go out and pretend and not open up a shop, but go and put this stuff to work, and then come back next week and we give you a little bit more, and come back the following week and we give you a little bit more. As Rob said, you know, spiritual work, not spiritual easy. Well spoken and accurate as always, benedicciones. You know, I really think that the idea of what happens in a tradition, an initiatory tradition, no matter where it is the most compassionate way that those practitioners, especially those practitioners who are you know, who come to their practice born of blood, because remember, especially when we talk about the Afro-Caribbean traditions, when we say born of blood, we're not just talking about the blood that courses through your veins. We're often talking about the blood that's spilled from those veins. And so the most compassionate thing someone can do is not to dump the raw emotion that you'll never understand of their trauma on you, but to say, please respect what our people have been through. And so it may be that you will be a guest forever. And that's okay, because that's still a privilege.
Oh, for sure.
If for me, as a person who loves Oromia, who loves Oshun, who loves Yamaya and Maria Padilla, for me, just to be able to be in the presence of people whose tradition that is a privilege and a joy, and I can't get enough. And it doesn't mean, let's put your ego aside. Screw that. You know, oh, I'm going to get to be you know, a priest or priestess, or you don't even have to be an initiate. Just shut up long enough to recognize what a privilege it is to sit in the presence of those great ones and
also,
their children.
And when you get adopted into those kinds of families, when you get adopted into these kinds of practices, they become like a family to you. They become, you know, more than just, oh, this is what I practice. And because of that, when you see injustice happening towards those people or towards the community of those people, that's when you figure out what your role is. Am I the social justice fighter? Am I the protester? Am I the people who have the uncomfortable conversations? Am I the fundraiser person? Figure out what your role is and do that and fight for that thing, because you've already made the commitment. You've said, I want to be a part of your spirituality. Okay, be a part of my spirituality, but don't forget to fight for my people in whatever capacity that is for you. You know, that's the other half of it, because it's self work. It's also communal work. You know, our ancestry is very much about community.
Absolutely, and that just tied it in perfectly. That's why I love having you on. To why we do this show, to be able to give a voice to subjects and topics that might be uncomfortable for some to hear, but without which we can't be authentic practitioners. And so I thank you and Dominic, and I'm so sorry that Dominic was having internet issues. You could tell what Mercury's getting ready to do. It's been happening all day. But to everybody who's watching, we want to thank you for tuning in as well. Leilani, I love you and appreciate you and
Thank you.
the
This
work
was so
that you
much
do.
fun.
And we'll definitely have you on again, because like I said, we could have gone for another 30, 40 minutes and barely scratched the surface. And for everybody else who's tuning in, thanks for tuning in. Keep the questions coming. Keep the comments coming. And we're going to wrap out the show tonight by sharing just a little bit about the Mystery School, where Dominic is one of our faculty members. If you would like more information, there will also be on the finished version of this video. This is the raw take, but by the time you can see this on YouTube or publicly on Facebook, there will be little graphics that show up on the screen that tell you how to get a hold of Leilani, how to get a hold of Dominic, and of course, how to get a hold of myself. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you soon. As we say at the end of every show, we encourage you to stay in the moment. That's the only place we have. Fill that moment with gratitude. Fill it with respect. Fill it with the desire to be of service to one another. And always remember, the best is yet to come. We'll talk to you soon.